talking about national traditions which describe a national experience. The ancestors of the people who have the tradition are described as having an experience which we would expect would change the life of the nation. And I said that we're talking about national traditions all over the world, national experiences not necessarily having anything to do with religion. They could be wars, they could be technological inventions, they could be migrations, they could be pestilences. And I said there's not a single one that's known to be false, not one. And therefore, human experience, that includes all of humanity. I stress this because always I get someone saying, but you're just assuming that what the book says is true and you're assuming Judaism is true. Absolutely not. I'm not assuming anything of the kind. I'm calling it into question. I'm wondering what reason we have to accept it as true. So, we don't have any known cases that are false. Now, I imagined a critic yesterday who said, Rabbi, you're telling us to trust this tradition. We have the tradition and we're supposed to trust that it's true. I can easily imagine scenarios whereby this tradition could be created and not be true. It could be the priests who feed mescaline to the population and whip them into a frenzy and then tell them there was a national revelation. Or it could be the soldiers who kill out all the history teachers and put soldiers in as history teachers and teach the little children this phony story. Or more likely, something happens, a natural event happens that's very shocking and frightening, like a volcanic eruption or like an earthquake or like a tsunami or something. And then as this story is transmitted down through the generations, it gets gradually changed, gradually aggrandized, gradually elaborated, until after 300 years it becomes a story of a revelation. That's called myth formation. That definitely happens in some types of cases with other nations. Rabbi, I can easily imagine a scenario whereby your tradition came into existence and not be true. Why do you think then I should trust it? So I ended yesterday by saying, we will pose the following dilemma to the critic. When you say you can easily imagine such a scenario, are you suggesting, therefore, that it's possible that our tradition came into existence through such a scenario? Or are you suggesting that it's probable that it came into existence through such a scenario? The critic has to make up his mind. What is he asserting? Is he asserting that it's possible or probable? If he asserts it's possible, then for the 16th time, we give that to him. Of course it's possible. Leprechauns are also possible. Possibilities are irrelevant. I don't live my life on the basis of what's possible. I live my life on the basis of what I have evidence for and against. Yeah.
What if one of those stories to you is more probable?
1 second, I'm coming to that. So then the critic has to say, no, I mean that one of those stories is probable. Okay, now, I said yesterday, and this is what I'm going to flesh out right now, I said, given what I've already told you, it's going to be impossible for him to show that it's probable. He will not be able to make good that claim, that it's probable. So let's start. He's telling me there's a scenario. A scenario means some process, some historical process, the priest with the mescaline, or the soldiers killing off the history teachers, or an event, and then transforming the event and changing the event over hundreds of years, changing it into a different story. There's some scenario for which there's a probability that it created our tradition. Okay, how am I going to show that a scenario is probable? How am I going to show that there's a certain process for which it's probable that it created our false tradition? The only way you could do that is show some real cases in history where this scenario worked to create false traditions like ours. Let's suppose, given the whole of the world, the Chinese and the Eskimos and the Nigerians and the Native Americans and everybody, suppose you could show 3 cases where the scenario you're describing really worked. Real concrete people, real concrete nations, real concrete religions and traditions, where they have a tradition, and the tradition is a tradition like ours, national tradition about a national experience that would change the life of the nation. And it's false. We know the tradition is false. And it was created by your scenario. If that happened 3 times in all of human history, then I think I would start to take the critic seriously. You showed that it really happened in real history to real people 3 times. So it does happen. It does happen in the world. Well then, there's some probability that it happened in our case too. Maybe 3 is a very small number, but at least that would be something to go on to build a probability. But he can't do that. He can't do that. Why can't he do that? Because again, what does he have to do? He has to show that his scenario really produced a false tradition of our kind. To do that, he's got to have some samples of false traditions of our kind. But there aren't any known false traditions of our kind. None at all. So, a fortiori, or kal v'chomer, if there aren't any known false traditions like ours, he can't find a case where a scenario produced a false tradition like ours, because he hasn't got any examples of false traditions like ours. So he cannot succeed. He cannot show that it's probable. Then he has to fall back on the claim that it's possible, which I gave up already now 17 times. Hold on one second. Now, to make this vivid, I want to give you an analogy. If it helps you, fine. If it doesn't, you can just forget it. A man sends a paper into a scientific journal, and he says, I'd like this to be considered for publication. And in it he says, I'm studying chicken DNA, and I have found a site where if it mutates in a certain way, the offspring will be born with 3 legs. And I've calculated the probability of the mutation, and if the temperature is above 75 degrees Fahrenheit, the probability is 1 in 100. And he has computer models and electron micrographic pictures of the DNA, the whole thing, all the scientific apparatus. Right? What is the journal going to do with this paper? It's going to throw it in the trash right away. Why? Because he's describing a process that has a product. The product is 3-legged chickens. And he's describing a process which should happen quite often. Above 75 degrees Fahrenheit, supposed to have a 1 in 100 chance of this mutation. And you got millions and millions of eggs. So there ought to be lots of 3-legged chickens running around. And there's 0 3-legged chickens. If there's 0 product, then the process isn't real. Again, if there's 0 product, then the process isn't real. Now you have a direct analogy here. This guy is claiming he's got a process that produces false traditions like ours. A real process. Not a possible process. Possible we give him. That's the 18th time. No, a probable process. A process that works in the real world to produce false traditions like ours. So I asked him for a few samples. But look, this is a process with a product. A process with a product. The product is false traditions like ours. He hasn't got any product. He hasn't got one. There are no known false traditions like ours. That being the case, he can't show me a process for that product, just like the guy can't show me a process that gives rise to 3-legged chickens, seeing as how there are no 3-legged chickens. So he can't make it probable. If he can't make it probable, then it's only possible. I'm giving that away the 20th time now. That's why he can't have an attack. Go back to the beginning. We're talking about using positive evidence and probability to make up our minds. I claim there's lots of positive evidence and probability. The critic is telling me that I'm drawing a wrong conclusion because there's a scenario that produces our types of traditions when they're false. I say to him, you mean it's probable? He says, yes. I say, well, to make it probable, you got to show it works at least a few times in the real world. And he can't do that because there are no known traditions like ours that are known, that are false, that are known to be false. So he's got to fail. Yeah.
Our true tradition has only shown 1 time, not 3.
Okay, now, this is a question, the way you're putting it, I had long, difficult, frustrating correspondence with a fellow about this point. I could not come to an agreement with him. I still think he's mistaken, but I realized that if I transmute his point through a few, color changes and shape changes and size changes, I can make it into something interesting, and I'll show you how that works. Let me give a parallel. Astronomers tell us that black holes do not emit light. Okay, they've examined what they think are black holes, quite a number, and no light comes out. Is that okay? Is a mistake being made here? Is something missing? The proposition is black holes don't emit light. They've examined black holes and found that they don't emit light. So then they say, probably that's true for all the black holes. I have an exact parallel. I say, traditions like ours are not known to be false. Traditions like ours are not known to be false. So I look at traditions like ours, and I ask, are any of them, and there are many traditions like ours, traditions of wars, traditions of pestilences, traditions of migrations, traditions of technological inventions, are there any traditions like that that are known to be false? There aren't. Well then, I've checked the right data, I've checked the right evidence, I have lots and lots of cases which follow my rule. They're traditions like mine, and they're not known to be false. So what am I missing? Why should I need anything else?
Because those traditions like war and all those things make sense in our physical world.
Okay, I'll come to that. I'll come to that. That's a legitimate problem. I'll come to that. I have a whole long discussion of that. But that's not the issue now. The issue now is that fellow Larry Tanner said to me, well, what about positive instances? Positive instances of what? The proposition is all traditions like ours are not known to be false. I've checked dozens and dozens. There isn't a single one that's known to be false. So the proposition is that no traditions like ours are known to be false. Well, what do I need then to check traditions to see if they're known to be false or not and find that they aren't? So I think in terms of the logic of the situation, it's perfectly good. But the critic could argue as follows. He could say, maybe there are none that are known to be false because none of them can be checked at all. They can't be checked at all. They're not available to be checked at all. And then, of course, none of them are known to be false because none of them can be checked. And then it's trivial. That's not real evidence at all. That's a legitimate objection. It took me a year and a half of correspondence to get to that with him, and he doesn't admit it yet. But that's a legitimate objection. So I went looking for historians of the ancient period. How do they draw their conclusions about events that took place? The answer is they use these traditions because typically these traditions bear out archaeologically. They bear out when you have corresponding records of other countries. If the tradition is that we were conquered by country A, if you look at the country A's history, you'll find that they have a tradition that they conquered this country at the same time. So these things are borne out when there is enough evidence to check, and there's many times enough evidence to check, they check out as true. So we have many that check out as true and none that check out as false. This is a type of information that has never been known to fail. So I say, the experience that mankind has with traditions like this is very good. Do people make mistakes? Yes. Do nations make mistakes? Yes. Do cultures make mistakes? Yes. Do religions make mistakes? Yes. But they don't make every kind of mistake. They don't make every kind of mistake. They're not always wrong in everything. And here's a very narrow class of traditions, a national tradition about a national experience that you would expect to change the life of the nation. And in this very narrow class, it seems that national traditions are accurate because we have no known failures, none, and many known successes. So that being the case, I think we have enormous evidence to take the event at Sinai as a real historical event. Is it possible that it's a mistake? Sure, but anything's possible, yeah.
Is possible that there's some situation worth anything, like in the way that like, if you could think of 100, 1,000 different situations, and like the sum of the situations, the sum of the probabilities could be like more likely than the other one?
Sure, if they're probabilities. But that's the crucial gap between probability and possibility. Possibilities can be multiplied to infinity and get you the same zero that you started with, right? A blue-eyed leprechaun, a brown-eyed leprechaun, a gray-eyed leprechaun, a pink-eyed leprechaun. Does it make leprechauns more probable because they change the eye colors? Probably not, right? 6-inch tall leprechaun, 7-inch tall leprechaun, 8-inch tall leprechaun, 9-inch. The leprechauns become more probable because they just multiply the differences? Obviously not. We have no evidence whatsoever for them. So probability, as far as we know, is uncalculable. It's just there's no evidence for them at all. And multiplying more possibilities for which I have no evidence, doesn't do me any good. Yeah.
Rabbi, in the case of like Greek mythology, they look at natural events like such as lightning, and they attribute like a god to it, such as like Zeus. Is there? I mean, have people argued that there is evidence that a natural phenomenon did happen at Mount Sinai, and that was taken to be a supernatural phenomenon?
Good. So this is a good example of the same thing that I'm talking about. I talked about a volcanic eruption or an earthquake and so forth and so on. But if a person or a group, a nation, can take a natural event and a natural national experience and elevate it into a supernatural event,
Right.
that should have happened more than once. It should have happened more than once in human history.
So you're saying because in the book there's a couple instances, or more than a couple instances, but a lot of instances of supernatural phenomenon, natural and supernatural phenomena that did happen, and we were right.
No, I'm not saying anything like that. I'm not appealing to that. What I'm saying is you're describing a certain psychology.
Right.
Something happens and you interpret it a certain way.
Right.
So first of all, I'm talking about a national experience.
Right.
Not one ancient Greek believed that people saw Zeus making the lightning. No Greek thought that Zeus's making the lightning was experienced. What they experienced was the lightning. And they believed that Zeus produced it. That doesn't come into my definition at all. I'm talking about what you directly experience.
Direct.
Right? What you directly experience. You can believe all that you like what you directly experience. One of the ancient Greek philosophers said that everything's made of water. That's not an experience. That's a theory. Right? I wouldn't say that our principles apply to that. That's just his theory as to how things are made.
So
It turned out to be dead wrong.
the experience was that Moses went up to Mount Sinai.
No, the experience was that all the people simultaneously heard God speaking.
But they didn't use that terminology exactly. God speaking. They said they heard something.
How do you know? How do you know what they said?
I don't know. It doesn't say in the Chumash.
Sure, it says God spoke all these words saying.
Okay.
No,
Where
but
would that be?
Chapter 20 in the book of Exodus. Anyway, but I want to address his problem now because
thing that all those little probabilities, to me, even if you give them a 0.5% chance that that's probable, is much more probable to me than the mountain being lifted over them, their souls being blasted out of them, like all these things that we've never seen in our lifetime.
But you see, if you are going to appeal to a scenario which, as far as you know, has never occurred, then you don't have a 0.5% probability. You've just imagined it. You just imagined it.
Like I've seen like a husband and wife tell like the same story that they were both at with radically different detail.
Yes, that's because it's two individuals. But we're talking now about a whole nation. That's precisely why I've picked this category the way I've picked it. Because when you talk about individuals, you get all sorts of different stories. But when you talk about an experience that a nation has simultaneously, we don't have contrasting stories about national experiences. We have single stories about national experiences, which are major historical events. You don't have contrasting stories about that. I have none that we know to be false. Now, his point that I acknowledged before, we should talk about that for a while, and that is, a person will say,
So, you were talking about how those kind of national experiences are privative to the Jews, but what about things like in other religions? For example, events like Jesus turning water into wine that was seen not only by hundreds of people, but it's also historically documented on the book of Paul, of Lucas, and Matthew.
Yeah, historically documented by his followers. Thank you.
But
that counts for a lot.
What about the Exodus? It's documented by probably the biggest follower of God at the time, which is Moses.
Of course, but that's the difference between a national event and not. I researched the Christian miracles. The largest number of people who are claimed, there are several different stories about turning the water into wine, and the loaves into fishes, and they take place in different places and at different times. But okay, there's different stories. The largest number that's claimed is 5,000. All of them are unnamed. There are no names. Except for the 17 disciples, all are unnamed. All 5,000 are unnamed. Now, you're talking about 5,000 people out of a local population of hundreds of thousands of people. That's a very, very small percentage.
So
that is not at all a national experience. And if you ask, okay, it isn't a national experience. Yes, it's a small percentage, but what difference does it make? I'll show you what difference it makes. Now I'm doing something which I used to do first, but people got confused as to the logic of the situation. So now I do it only at the end. Someone could ask, we'll do this by stages. Someone could say, look, you made up this category. You chose it. You sliced it so it would work. Anybody could do that. You just slice categories until you make them work. Actually, slicing the categories until they work is standard scientific procedure. I'll show you. Water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. Not on mountaintops, it doesn't. Boils at a lower temperature. Oh, I mean at sea level air pressure. Not salt water, doesn't. Oh, I meant pure water. Not water on a spinning surface where it's in motion. I meant still pure water at sea level air pressure. So what are you doing? Aren't you carving it out? Just carving it out to make it work. Sure, that's how science works. If you have counterexamples, then you carve it smaller to make sure there aren't any counterexamples. So there's nothing wrong with carving it to make it work. That's how science operates. But more than that, there's an intuition behind this category. Trouble is, intuition is only intuition. But there is an intuition. And the reason I call it the Kuzari principle is because the book called The Kuzari states this intuition. Imagine that the thing never happened and you're making it up. Imagine you're making it up and trying to get people to believe it. Well, some things you can get people to believe and some things you can't. And it depends roughly on how good your memory is, how good you think your memory is, how good you trust your memory to be. So, for example, I mentioned yesterday or the day before, no one's going to convince you that you went swimming yesterday. If you didn't go swimming, not any amount of evidence, photographs of you at the pool and all the rest, you're going to say they're faked, it's Photoshop. It can't be, because I know if I went swimming yesterday, I'd remember it. But you got drunk last night. No, I didn't. I know exactly what I did. I was listening to a very boring lecture someplace, and I went to sleep frustrated, and I know I didn't get drunk either. Somebody said to you that 3 years ago, the week of July 7th, you went swimming, and you don't remember it. You say, well, I don't remember it because I don't keep track of things like that. So I don't expect to remember it. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're not. The fact that I don't remember it, I wouldn't take so seriously. But the fact that I don't remember swimming yesterday, that's ridiculous. Now, that's true for individuals, for families, for social groups, for cities, and for nations. Try to tell contemporary Americans that in 1650, the early American settlers made a military campaign and conquered all of Central and South America. And they held on to it for 30 years, and then there were revolts and they were beaten back. No one's going to believe that. That's 350 years ago, 400 years ago. Why wouldn't they believe it? Because they say, if we did something like that, it would be remembered. That's not the sort of thing that people forget. You conquer Central and South America and hold it for 30 years, that would be in our historical traditions. It's not the sort of thing that people forget. If you tell people that in 1732 there was a disastrous grain crop and a lot of people starved over the winter, and nobody remembers that, it's not written in any history books, you say, well, it's a one-year event, and those times records were not well kept. And it's not the sort of thing that was important enough to be remembered 100 years later, so people let it go by. You're going to judge, when somebody tells you a story, whether to accept it or not, you're going to judge whether, if it really happened, people would remember it. And if people would remember it, then you're going to say, you can't be right, because you're telling me a story that nobody remembers. And people should remember this. That's a very strong intuition. Now, a story about a national experience. The whole ancestry of the nation had this experience. And it's the kind of thing which you would expect people to remember. When the guy comes and tells a story, the intuition is people aren't going to accept it. They aren't going to accept it because they're going to say, if you're right, it should be remembered. That's an intuition. How good is an intuition? How strong is it? How reliable is it? Suppose somebody says, I disagree. I agree there's resistance here. It's not like being told that in 1 year there was a disastrous crop, but I think it could be overcome. I think that clever people with enough mescaline and so forth and so on could do the job.
Coins. Paying them.
Yeah, paying them, right?
Pay 'em
Sure.
off.
Yeah, paying them.
Say you're
So now, if there's going to be this clash of intuitions, I don't know any way to show whose intuition is better. Somebody tells me, and over the years, people have told me, I just don't share your intuition. I don't think people are as reasonable as you do. I think people are more impressionable, more malleable than you do, and I think you could get it across. So I say the intuition suggests an idea. It doesn't justify the idea. It doesn't justify the idea. The only way to justify the idea is with evidence. And that's why I did the historical survey. The intuition suggests that there's resistance here. Even the critic will agree that there is resistance. He'll just say, I think the resistance could be overcome. My intuition tells me the resistance can't be overcome. Okay, standoff. At this point, it's a standoff. So then I say, the reason for accepting my proposition is not the intuition that it'll be hard to do. The reason for accepting it is the historical survey that it's never been done. If it's never been done, then that shows you it's hard to do. For all we know, it's impossible to do because no one has ever done it. So the intuition shows me why it's a natural category. It's worthy of research because there's some sense that we have resistance here. Then the question is, how strong is the resistance? The historical survey shows that the resistance is really very, very strong. That's why I do it this way. What happened was people read my essay, and I put this last part about the evidence at the end. And before they got to the end, they said, I have the opposite intuition, so your argument is worthless. And I kept quoting them, the part at the end. It says, did you read these paragraphs at the end where I ask what's the reason for accepting it? Of course, they hadn't read it, and they don't want to take it into account, and so on and so on. So about 3 years ago, I said, dope, do it backwards. Present the evidence first. Make the proposition clear first. Somebody asks for the intuition behind it. You give the intuition at the end. But it's clear now, I hope, that the evidence is from the historical survey. And the intuition is just what suggests the proposition for testing, and you test it by the historical survey. Yeah.
So going back to those type of things of national experiences, if those events, let's say, happened among hundreds of people, like multiplying bread and fish and wine into water and all of those things, I mean, we're talking almost about a national experience because it happened on
No, not at all. You're talking about 2% of the local population. Now let's follow it out. Let me finish the argument that I started. Imagine making it up 30 years later. Imagine making it up 30 years later. Making it up. Pretending. You say to people, 30 years ago, our leader sat with 5,000 people and created these fishes. And what is a person in the audience going to say? Is he going to say, wait a minute, if that happened, everybody should know about it? Why should everybody know about it? It's 2% of the population. My grandfather wasn't there. Your grandfather wasn't there. Your grandfather wasn't there. It's 2% of the population. So I wouldn't have to know it. There's no reason for me to expect the information would reach me. So therefore, I have no way to test it. I have no way to check it. If I have no way to check it, then I may trust you to tell me something I don't know. The whole point of its being a national tradition is that if you tried to make it up later, you'd have resistance because everybody would know that they should have heard of it.
I know that on the Talmud, Jesus is being mentioned several times.
But we're going from item to item. We're going from item to item. There's no end to items that can be brought up. But I'd like to stay focused on this particular issue. And by the way, there's a book called The Religions of Man by, guess what I want to name it. It'll come back to me. So it was a book that was written in the 70s, was redone in the 90s, became a film, became very famous. The researcher is very celebrated. I became attracted to the book because he's a Christian writing about Judaism, and what he writes about Judaism is good. It's good. It's solid. He understands. I thought, wow, here's a Christian who understands Judaism. Good chance he understands Hinduism as well, and he understands Buddhism as well. If he can get that far out of himself to understand something, he's very good. And he writes that there were so many mystery cults at the time of the beginning of Christianity that if all you had for the founder of Christianity were stories about the miracles that he did, he would have been forgotten by everybody, because there were so many stories. This guy was buried under a pile of dirt for 3 days and came out. This guy levitates. This guy can read your mind. There were so many stories like that with just another miracle worker, and there were lots of miracle workers. If that's all he had done, no one would have remembered him. So if you're trying to make up the story later, the audience will say, maybe yes, maybe no. Even if he did it, it just goes into the general mill of stories and might not have come to me, so I have no way to check. It's not at all like saying that one day he flew over the whole of Palestine, around and around and around, and all of the millions of people in Palestine saw him at that time. That's a different story. If they had said that, that would be convincing. If they had believed that, that would be convincing. But that they believed that 2% of the population went off to a lake someplace and he did something for them. By the way, if you look at the stories, it's very fascinating. In all but one of the accounts of the stories, the people don't know it's a miracle. The people don't know it's a miracle. Only the disciples say it's a miracle. After all, I'm hungry, right? The basket's coming around. I see a couple of loaves, take out a loaf, and I pass it on. Am I going to check whether it works 25 people down the line? I'm eating my bread. That they got another basket? I don't know. Did they get another basket? I don't care. I'm eating. In all the stories but one, they don't even notice it that it's a miracle. The 5,000 don't notice it's a miracle. They just eat. The disciples say, hey, it's the same basket going around. Gosh, look at that miracle. But they're the disciples, right? They're the in-group that's promoting this. So it's very, very unconvincing in and of itself, but it's not my proposition at all. 2% of a population is not a whole nation. And it makes a difference, because if it's only 2%, it's easy to make the story up. If it's the whole population, it's very hard to make the story up.
It's less than 2, right?
I mean,
It's like nothing.
yeah, it's very, very small, and none of them are named. And then 10 years later, someone makes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and he reports that half of them are already dead. In 10 years, were they all very old people or something? No ages are given. I mean, it's an anonymous story of the kind that you find, you know.
So why is it so many people believe in it?
Okay, this is very important. This is very important. The principle that I'm advocating is a very narrow principle. It says, false beliefs of a certain narrow type don't form. It is absolutely non-committal about other mistakes. It's absolutely non-committal. People, and that's why I said it a while ago, I said, lots of people make lots of mistakes. Cultures and religions and nations make lots of mistakes, but they don't make every kind of mistake. There's one, maybe a couple of others that they don't make, because the historical record is they don't make these kinds of mistakes, but they make lots of other kinds of mistakes. You ask why they make these mistakes? I don't know that I'm responsible to answer that. I'm pushing my theory about this particular kind of mistake they don't make. But I would say that if you want, people to make mistakes usually when there's absence of evidence. In the Iliad, Achilles goes up the mountain and he comes down and he says, I had a conference with Pallas Athene, one of the Greek gods, and she gave me a strategy, and she says she's going to help us. Okay, as we say in Hebrew, Oshikein Oshalo. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. He's telling us what happened to him alone on the mountain. By the way, the Iliad then says, in a later chapter, that the goddess Athene actually comes down on the battlefield with her chariot and fights on the side of the Greeks. So I read that, I said, hey, boy, that sounds pretty public. But then the text is very careful to specify that she goes by so fast and kicks up so much dust that all you see is the dust. You can't see her and her chariot. Only the dust you can see. We just know it's her and her chariot, but we can't see that. I said, okay. He was very careful. He made sure that it wasn't an experience. It wasn't even an army-wide experience, because he knew that if he claimed they all saw her, it would fall flat. Right? By the way, anti-Semitism is another good example of this. We've suffered from vicious anti-Semitism for thousands of years. Vicious, brutal anti-Semitism. Not once has an anti-Semite made up a story about a large-scale experience. Not once. Christians are stolen before Passover, and they're slaughtered, and their blood is used for the matzah. Why? Because a Christian child goes missing. How does it go missing? When does it go missing? It just doesn't show up one day. Completely mysterious, without any cause. And then they say the Jews took his blood. But they never say the Jews came, all of them, all 5,000 local Jews came to the marketplace at noon when everybody was there and stole a Christian child. They never say that. Why not? Why not? They're vicious anti-Semites. They're not fully rational because you can't make up a story like that because it's too public. If it's public like that, then people are not going to accept it. And this is true with myths generally. Dragons. Medieval people believed in dragons. Sure, in the dead of night, in the forest, people wandering through the forest, they come out, dented and bruised, they ran into the dragon. But no medieval myth says that the dragon came to downtown London in the middle of the day and burned up people with its fiery breath and drowned in the Thames. Why not? These people have fanciful imaginations. If they're superstitious, why don't you have a myth like that? Answer, because you can't make up stories like that because there's too much social tradition that would make it impossible to substantiate. You can't do that. That's why I did this survey of ancient myths, and I say there's not a single myth that meets this description, this categorization. Yeah.
So it's highly probable that the events at Sinai happened.
Right.
Could you then say it's improbable that it has to do with a higher power?
Well, if I just take the description of what they experienced, 3 million people all heard God speaking simultaneously. And they all got the same text. And the mountain was shaking. And there was fire on the top of the mountain. And was covered with smoke. And there was fog. The sound of a shofar. That's not the sort of thing that even lightning produces. It's too detailed. The details are consistent. And they give the picture of an event which, in terms of 3,100 years ago, there's no natural way in which that could be produced.
In the terms of back then, right?
Right. Exactly. So somebody say, oh, it's E.T. So the same is E.T. possible or probable? If it's probable, I want evidence. I want evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence. I want evidence for star travel. I want evidence. There's no evidence at all. Then it's a mere possibility, and then we're back to square one. Yeah.
But I'm still curious to know, like, why there's if people know that only like 5,000 people saw it and the rest didn't, then why is there still like so many people that like believe in all that?
So let me try this a different way. I'm talking about a wall against forming certain beliefs. Try to form a belief like this, you end up with a wall. My wall is, if it's a national tradition, of a national experience that would change the life of the nation, you're not going to get over that wall and form the belief in that tradition. Okay, now you're taking cases where there is no wall. If there's no wall, then nothing's stopping them from forming the belief. You know, people believe things on the basis of what they like, or what they hope, or what they're afraid of. And they don't always need evidence to justify the belief that they accept. I'm talking about the opposite, where you accept a belief that's against all the evidence you have. And the evidence is a particularly vivid kind. I'm saying that when the belief is against all the evidence that you have, and this kind of evidence, then you don't form it. You're talking about cases where there isn't evidence available. Well, if there isn't evidence available, then people will form their beliefs in a much looser fashion. That's the way I would explain it. Somebody tells you, when Achilles says, I spoke with Parathlatini on the mountaintop, you don't have any evidence against that. Now, you don't have any positive evidence in favor of it, but he's a great warrior, and he may have a reputation for trustworthiness, so you accept his word. When your parents tell you what you did when you were 1 year old, and they didn't video it, you have no evidence for that whatsoever, except they told you. Typically, you'll accept it, because they're your parents. You expect them to be telling the truth. So you don't, right? It's not up against the barrier of counter-evidence. I'm talking about not forming a belief when there's a barrier of counter-evidence. When there's no barrier of counter-evidence, so then, sky's the limit. Yeah.
So the Jews got the first 2 commandments at Sinai, and then Moses went up to the mountain by himself, and then gave the rest back to the Jewish people?
No, not exactly right. But there is a complication here, and I'll tell you, you have to read all the Rashis, and then there's a key commentator who explains how the Rashi works. The scenario that Rashi describes is this. They heard one compound, complex sound in which all of the 10 people speak of the 10 Commandments. It's 10 pronouncements. There are about 14 or 15 commandments there. They heard all of the 10 pronouncements combined into a single compound complex sound, which was utterly unintelligible. Utterly unintelligible. All they heard was a mass of noise. Then God explained the first 2, and Moses explained the last 8, and having had it explained, they could go back and hear those individual statements in the complex sound. What is it like? Did any of you ever study? You're all Americans, so you're handicapped in this. Did you ever study a foreign language?
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, so now, when you start with a foreign language, you hear people speaking it, it's absolute gibberish. I remember when I tried, I was becoming religious, and I'd listen to songs in Yiddish. So I imitated the sounds as best I could. It's just that I didn't end the words at the right places. I ended in the middle and put them together in different ways. I had no clue what I was saying. It was just unintelligible sound. Later, when I learned what the words meant, so then I knew how to segment it and I knew what I was talking about. They went back and heard all of the content in the original sound. They could detect, they could pull apart the individual strands and see the individual pieces. I don't know if anybody here does music, but I did music for many years, seriously. And I was surprised to find out, listen to the string quartet, and you tell the person, listen to the cello. And he says, what? What, cello? I just hear music. I just hear, music. But there are 4 instruments. Listen to that instrument. He doesn't know what I'm talking about. He can't do it. You have to be trained to do that. When you become experienced enough in music, then it becomes easy. You just listen to the viola. Okay, I'll pick out the viola part and listen to that. But you have to be trained to do that. So in the end, they got the whole text of the 10 pronouncements from the original revelation from God, but it was a 2-step process. First, it was a ball of sound, which they couldn't pull out the pieces of. They couldn't distinguish the pieces of it. Then they were showed how to pull the pieces out, and they went back and they could hear it in the original sound. Now, the process of pulling out the content, the first 2 were done by God, and the last 2 were done by Moses. But in the end, what they heard was all of it from God.
What about after the first 10 pronouncements?
So after that, it all comes from Moses. I'm only talking about the revelation from God.
Okay.
You're right. That's a separate issue, and that has to be addressed separately. It has to be addressed separately. What reason do we have to trust all the rest of the information which came from Moses? And that's a separate issue. Quite right. Quite right. Didn't get to the miracle part yet. Yeah.
Aren't you taking the probability of and then breaking it down into separate possibilities? Like, one would say, no, God spoke specific words to the Hebrew people, and then aren't you just saying, well, no, it's possible that it was just a ball of sound, and then... No, I'm not saying what's possible. We're not guessing here. If we were guessing, I would disqualify it altogether. It's sort of like what I said in the first lecture, that we don't guess what God is like because we're not qualified to guess. We have a tradition that this is the way it was done. This is the way Rashi explains our traditional sources on the subject. So that's following a traditional account of how it was done. It's not a question of thinking up a possibility. The text is very how was I say, very sparse here. The text just says God spoke these words. It could be that he spoke them in a 2-stage process. The text just is non-committal about that. Okay, now let me address his question, because he raised a question before which at least has to be addressed a little bit. And we'll see what's happening tomorrow. We can follow it if there's some of you here tomorrow. What about the fact that these national traditions that I talked about, and I gave all sorts of examples, all of the examples I gave were natural events, and we're now using this sort of tradition to support a supernatural event. Isn't that a jump? Isn't that a jump? There's a cliche about which goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's pretty vague, but it's not unreasonable. And this is an extraordinary claim. It's a claim of something that's miraculous. So does the fact that this type of tradition is, as far as we know, perfectly accurate on natural events, does that really support a tradition that refers to a supernatural event? Or is that too big a gap to cross? I think that's a good question. It's a good, reasonable, logical question. I think it's not too big a gap to cross, but to show that, I have to do some work. We have about 12 minutes now. Let me at least lay the groundwork. I think this gap between miraculous and natural, I think we have to consider, ponder,
How much resistance to miracles is appropriate? How much resistance to miracles is appropriate? Let's say someone says, I'm against miracles. I believe in natural law. I believe in what science teaches. I believe in physics and chemistry and biology. That's what I believe in. And you're talking about something that violates all of that? Forget it. Out of the question, out of the picture. You know, sell it to people who drink themselves to death. I'm a normal, reasonable, logical, healthy person, and I don't buy miracles. Okay. And if I ask, and what exactly do you mean by miracle? He'll say, I told you already, something that violates natural law. And if I ask, natural law, which natural laws would those be? Which ones are you committed to? And you're not going to hear about any possible violation? Do you mean the ones that science teaches now? Is that what you mean? No violations of what science teaches now? Well, let me ask you a question. Suppose someone took that attitude 500 years ago. Where would we be today? We'd be where we were 500 years ago. Because those laws were all wrong. What science taught 500 years ago was all wrong. And if you're not going to hear violations, you're never going to make progress. So let's think again. When you say you're not going to accept violations of natural law, which natural laws do you mean? Today's natural laws? Then you're condemning yourself never to make progress. That's not reasonable, is it? So he says, this is a position that's actually been taken. I'm not making this up. So he says, no, I mean, nothing can violate the laws of nature that science will finally get to when science finally understands how the world works. Well, maybe, but since you haven't got a clue what those laws are like, you can't use that commitment to rule out my event. Maybe my event will be consistent with those laws that science will ultimately get to. How do you know? After all, 100 years ago, no one dreamt of the laws that science teaches today. No one dreamt of, well, we have to go back 120 years. 120 years ago, no one dreamt of quantum mechanics or relativity. Maybe the laws are going to change in drastic ways in the future. So to rule out miracles in principle to take a very unreasonable position. Okay, so then you say, well, okay, I can't rule them out in principle, but since they do describe things which are different from what we know, I want good solid evidence. Now, some will say, I want experimental evidence. I want repeated observations of the thing over and over again under controlled conditions. Okay, I want you to consider the following scenario. In ancient Greece, there was philosophy, there was science, and they had a position that the heavens are unchanging. They're unchanging. Our world has plenty of change in it because things are made out of compounds of 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and the combinations are unstable, and they come apart, and they're recombined. That's why there's change. The heavens are made of quintessence. Quint means 5. It means the 5th essence. A single 5th essence which never changes. The heavens are eternal and never change. That was the Greek position. Now let's imagine a Greek is visiting China. He's there for an extended stay, talking to people, learning their culture. After a while, he comes across star charts. The ancient Chinese had very detailed star charts. They had a class of people whose job it was to make star charts. That's what they did. And one night, he's sitting there with a star chart, looking at the heavens, comparing the chart with the heavens. And then he calls over his Chinese friend and says, you know something? There's a mistake here. Because here there's a dot, and at that spot there's no star. So the Chinese says, well, it can't be. Our people are very careful. It can't be. Looks at this chart. Looks at the sky. There's a dot there. There's no star there. He said, wait a minute. Turn it over. Let's check the date of the chart. Turn it over. Oh, this chart is from 22 years ago. 16 years ago, a star disappeared. Now, the Greeks are going to find that very hard to accept. A star disappeared. Stars don't disappear. They don't. The heavens are eternal and unchanging, absolutely constant. That's what my culture, my philosophers, my scientists, that's what they teach me. That's what we believe for hundreds of years. No Greek has ever testified there was any change in the heavens. The Chinese says, sorry, tell me something. Do you Greeks make star charts like we do? Do you pay people to make charts of the sky? No, we don't do it. Well, maybe we know better. Maybe we know better. There was a star there. Now, in fact, in ancient China, they did observe nova explosions. I think 2. And the disappearance of stars. They did actually do that. Now, I ask a question. Could the Greek come to change his mind? Could he say, look, obviously these guys pay more attention to the heavens than we do. They have star charts. We don't. They seem to be reasonable people. They seem to be intelligent people. If they tell me that a star disappeared, then, maybe it did. And maybe our picture of how the heavens work is wrong. And maybe we should rethink our philosophy of the heavens. I think that could happen. Without it being a laboratory experiment, without repeated observations, on the credibility of the group that's providing the information. If they're generally credible, then you can come to doubt your philosophy, your science, your theories about how things work on the grounds of that credibility. A similar, not exactly the same, but a similar example would be Madame Curie. Madame Curie had some pitch blende in which there was some radium, and she put it on a desk. You all know the famous story. In the drawer, she had a photographic plate in a packaging, and there's a metal key on top. And a while later, she came back and she pulled out the photographic plate. It was all exposed except for the image of the key. And she said, well, the pitch blende has in it radium, and the radium sends out invisible rays. Got it, boys and girls? Invisible rays. Visible rays. Sends out invisible rays that go through the wood and go through the packaging of the photographic plate, but they can't go through the metal of the key. And that's why it got exposed except for the image of the key. I have another hypothesis. When she wasn't there, somebody switched the plates and played a joke on her. Isn't that much simpler? Do I have to believe in invisible rays? But she was a reputable scientist. So people said, at least it's worth checking. Now, there are hundreds of reports from all over the world all the time that people just dismiss. They're not worth checking because they come from untrained and unqualified people. Levitation in India. We had a boy here who went to India and witnessed levitation. He witnessed it. Well, it's on a stadium, on the floor of a stadium. You're sitting in the chairs, and there's a big rug, 50 feet by 50 feet. This guy's lying under it with only his head showing, and by golly, he goes up. Of course, as he goes up, the rug drapes around him, and you're not allowed to go and check underneath to see whether there's something pushing him up, but that's levitation. That's what they show you. Okay, that's the way they do it. So, many, many claims aren't worthy checking. She said so. People respected her, and they said, probably something there, and we should probably check it out. So the fact that a report comes from a credible source can make you rethink your picture of how the world works. Such a thing can happen. So I'm claiming now that we have a credible source because it's the kind of tradition that has never gone wrong. That's very, very credible on the basis of our empirical experience. It's very credible. So if you have to cross this divide between the natural and the supernatural, I think that this evidence can do it. So I admit that there's a gap. I admit there's something that has to be argued. But I think the argument can be made for that reason. By the way, everything I've told you today is in print. It's on my website. You can read it. You don't have to worry about remembering it. You can actually read it. It's also verbally presented in those places as well. But that's it. Now, if you're here tomorrow, some of you are here tomorrow, since there's nothing scheduled on the thing, we can make it open Q&A and we can talk about this or anything else that's on your mind.